Yep. So welcome to the Dr. Taylor and Dr. Sohn show, or should I have done that the other way around? I don't know. That's fine. Okay, so today we're going to talk about research. Oh, what a surprise, we always do. But Dr. Sohn is here to share his perspective on qualitative approach and any other research that he feels like doing.
Yeah, okay. Well, the first thing I guess that we said we'd talk about was the decision whether you want to do a qualitative study or quantitative study. And for me, you know, what I hear, I guess what drew me to qualitative work was my mom did a qualitative study. And the first time that I read her introductory chapter, I felt like, oh, this is so honest. She's acknowledging her position as the researcher. She's saying, I'm the one doing this. She's not kind of hiding behind the cloak of the neutrality of mathematics, which at the time I had a problem with that.
Oh,
it's like,
yes.
You know, math isn't neutral. Statistics aren't neutral.
And the way you set it up can be very biased. So the bias comes in on the front end in quantitative and in the back end, usually more so in qualitative. So it can be there, and you have to think about it in both areas.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, in quantitative research, the bias is, I like the way you put that, at the beginning. Like you have, when you are isolating something, I sometimes say it's like when you're trying to isolate variables, it's like Humpty Dumpty is sitting on the wall and you just knock him off. And then you start looking at the little pieces.
Yes.
You know, and then you try to put them back together. But yeah, the bias comes in at the beginning. Qualitative research, often people assume it's a more holistic thing, but one of the things that I know that you always recommend, which is a term, triangulation, that we'll get into, is one way to make it less so.
Triangulation.
Sorry.
3 sources.
Yeah, you got when you, so for example, one of the trends, this is one of the topics on the list, is trends in qualitative research. One of the trends in qualitative research, which is driven by more widely available qualitative research software, is to just do an interview study. And people strictly go and interview maybe, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 20 people, sometimes more. But an interview study is simply that. You only get one type of data.
A table with 1 leg does not stand. A table with 2 legs will fall. A table with 3 legs is kind of wobbly, but if you set them out apart long enough, it'll stay up.
It's a triangular table.
4 legs is more stable, and that's why we have most of them that way. But yeah. 3 sources is really minimal.
So that is a trend anyway, is that's kind of an increasing thing of people will call things an interview study and be done with it. What the question is what's your question? What do you want to know? And then how do you think you can learn it? Right? One of the first things when you approach this, like you're trying to like either find knowledge or you are creating knowledge. And whether or not you believe you're finding knowledge or creating knowledge is a pretty important thing. With qualitative research, I would say people, they do both, but there's kind of a bias towards the idea that you are creating it, you are generating it. That is, you are the researcher and you are the instrument.
Right.
Whereas with a lot of quantitative research, you have specific instruments that are created that are separate from you. For example, a survey or some
right.
examples of instruments.
You know, one of my favorite professors, who, by the way, taught a course that was horrible, but he was one of my favorite professors. And he taught the quantitative hardcore statistics. He derived things, just great guy, use this stuff. He said something insightful, which is, because we asked him about qualitative, and of course, most really hardcore quantitative people are like, that that's useless.
Yeah.
But what he said was qualitative is important because it tells us what to study. Because it brings out the ideas that need to be run through in a quantitative study. And on the flip side, a qualitative person would say, well, quantitative may be useless, but it's kind of helpful after the fact, after we learn and understand something, then we can run a quantitative study. So they can feed off of each other and inform each other, but they do very different things. So like you said, it's all in what you want to ask.
Yeah. So the question of whether you're going to create knowledge or discover knowledge goes to some terms that qualitative researchers use a lot, which are epistemology and ontology. And epistemology is basically like a theory of knowledge, of knowing. And then ontology, in its most simple form, is what is the nature of reality? What is the world around us? And I read those terms dozens and dozens of times before I even began to think I understood them. And I still sometimes am like, how are they used? Sometimes I come across it and I'm like, what do they mean, the ontology of it's used in some weird
yes,
way?
But when I hear the word epistemological, when I say epistemological, I feel very smart.
Yeah, that's important. Part of becoming scholars is being able to feel smart. But the expertise that you're gonna generate, there's gonna be something behind it, and that's what epistemology is. It's like, what do you believe about knowledge? So when you read a research report, as you work on, developing your literature review, for example, you might read something. You say, oh, okay, so if you're reading a quantitative report, it's often reported as kind of a subjective thing, and then qualitative work is often reported as like, hey, this is just one perspective on the situation. And so what you believe about reality and knowledge will affect how you read that stuff. And then later it'll affect how you do your study. And in qualitative research, one of the important things that you'll see in the dissertation handbook is this idea of like the researcher. So positionality is a huge element of qualitative research. When you say, hey, I'm the researcher and I'm the instrument, you have to go ahead and reveal, like, here's the angle I'm approaching this project with.
And here's how I think it's going to turn out, but I'm open to the idea. If you do have a preconceived notion, and sharing that up front, any preconceived ideas, is important to, one, for the reader to understand where you're coming from, but two, so that you become aware that could taint it and you try to avoid it.
Yeah, the best, I always feel like I hear examples of journalism that kind of relate to like teaching qualitative research. And I remember hearing like interviews with authors who they go and they're going to write this book, and they're like, I ended up writing a completely different book than I thought I would write.
Right.
And it gives a sense of like, yeah, you have expectations and you think you're going to find certain things, but as you interview people or as you observe what's going on, the split between what's real and what's ideal becomes more and more apparent, and then you can no longer stick with that your original bias or your original assumption is turned on its head.
Let data change your mind.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about here a little bit is the history of qualitative research. And as you said a minute ago, quantitative researchers, some of them basically consider qualitative research fluffy, not serious, not rigorous. And the people with the quantitative research, research grants and so on, they're the ones with the money and the power historically. And so qualitative researchers had to really kind of fight for legitimacy. And there's a lot of different things that they've done over the years, and we kind of, even in the qualitative research that people here at Carson Newman do, we've inherited some of those things. So one of the things is this idea of triangulation, for example. You do want to kind of equal the rigor or trustworthiness is a big word that we use in qualitative research. So you want to make sure your knowledge that you generate is in some sense trustworthy. And that's kind of the why behind the triangulation, multiple data sources, those kinds of things. If you just do one, I've done research projects strictly with interviews, and the kind of work that I have spent the most time on was mostly focused on interviews, but we had all this other data that we could call on to kind of bring in and further support the things that people were saying.
Right. Well, that reminds me of the Tim's math and science video study from the original Tim's study. And they looked at math teachers who thought they were implementing the new NCTM standards at that point. And the ones who volunteered, yes, I'm doing it well in self-report, they followed up in their classrooms and observed and found that they were trying, and it was trivial implementations. It wasn't really getting at the heart of what they were doing. So just interviewing those teachers would look like they're high flyers in that area, and following through with a second source of data, it was very telling that many of those teachers weren't getting what they thought they were.
Yeah.
So that's one very big public example of the need for at least two, but three is minimum. Three sources of data.
Yeah.
And by three sources of data, I don't mean interview administrators, interview teachers, and interview students. That's one form of data.
That's right. Three sources of one form of data. Yeah. So let's see, what else? So one of the things on my list is theory and the use of theory in qualitative research. When you're taking on any research project, but particularly qualitative research opens up the possibilities for the different types of theory that can be used. But it would also be true that a quantitative study could be analyzed with, for example, just to use common examples, a constructivist theory or a behaviorist theory.
Right, and in this program, they fill out the worksheet before they do their dissertation, and they present that to you, the chair, or whoever chairs, and they have to pick a theoretical and a conceptual framework as part of the process. Now, when I explain, my short version is conceptual framework really comes from a combination of the literature, what are the key ideas, and the theoretical framework is a choice of how to look at it.
Yeah, right. And so it's kind of fun these days to look at different qualitative research paradigms and see how they use either theories that you've heard of for a very long time as educators. People are likely to have heard of constructivism, behaviorism, social cognitive theory. But when, the stuff that I'm reading these days, people are using different theoretical frameworks. For example, critical race theory is something that I've been looking at a lot, and it brings new knowledge. When you look at something with a new theory, you're looking at it like with different glasses.
Right.
And what that does is gives you something new to say. And so that's kind of a potential that can be fun to mess around with. Although it could also be intimidating.
Right. But I often use the community of practice as a framework because that, for me, and I do more qualitative than quantitative work, and it helps me think about what to look for, not in the content, but what are the pieces of evidence? Because what are the cultural practices? What are the norms? What are the reifications, which in layman's terms or closer to layman's terms, or what are the artifacts of the way they think and operate? And so that helps me think through things in a much deeper level. And then my one regret with my dissertation, other than misspelling something after the fact, was I used that as a theoretical framework, but I didn't say it, and nobody made me. And they should have.
Yeah.
But now, looking back, it's very clear that I was using that the whole time in everything that I did. So I'm not embarrassed about the work. I'm embarrassed that I didn't bring it out and say it.
Yeah. So with a lot of qualitative approaches, they kind of come with their own traditions, and sometimes it'll make a lot of sense to use the same kind of theoretical frameworks that have traditionally been used. Ethnography, for example, is a qualitative research methodology that came out of anthropology. And so they look at cultural practices. They kind of want to focus on like the culture of what you're seeing. With our particular degree program, an ethnography will always be a mini ethnography. You'll never have enough data collection.
You don't have enough time
to produce a full ethnography. Some people spend 2 to 3 years, for example, studying a particular classroom to produce an ethnography. Phenomenology is the research method I'm most familiar with. It comes with its own theoretical framework, which is, for in more common terms, it's existentialism. People look at existential issues like time, how people are relating to others around them in their world. One of the big existential ideas is existential project. So some people focus on like, well, what's the project here for these people? How are they approaching it? What kind of meaning does it have for them? Biography is the mainstream qualitative research method I'm least familiar with, but and I have no idea what kind of theoretical frameworks usually accompany that, but I feel like it's, from what I know of it, it is a little bit more journalistic.
Right.
Narrative analysis is another research methodology that I've looked at carefully, and that theoretical framework that goes along with narrative analysis is usually like looking at everything as stories. And they even believe, you talk about epistemology and ontology, people in narrative analysis believe that the humans are natural storytellers, and that almost everything that we create, even education systems, are understood best in terms of story.
And a constructivist would say, well, that story is a combination of all those connections that they've made in their brain. Yeah. And you can look at it that way, or you can call it a story and still see things that connect and the way they connect and why they connect that way.
Yeah, and that's what's fun, as I hope, when you're actually doing a good literature review, you actually get to see sometimes a very similar topic taken on with two quite different approaches. And you, as the budding scholar, are going to benefit, even if you think, that's not for me. But it at least gives a different way of seeing, or a different way of knowing the same thing, which lends to your expertise.
Right. Right. What else do you have on?
There's a few other, one of the other kind of mainstream qualitative research approaches these days is discourse analysis. And has anybody done that?
No.
So discourse analysis can be fun in that you're really picking apart the language. So discourse is another word that
And this
see it so many times.
symbolic interactionism is a way of looking at discourse, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I haven't done a study per se as part of a class once, really far out liberal class.
Yeah.
We had to go through some conversations and dig deep to see what was there. Try unpack, deconstruct, unpack what are the meanings for the participants, and and it makes you think completely differently. Instead of just taking the word at face value, you're looking at what might be motivating that, and then labeling the meanings, and then look for patterns across conversations, across people, and then you pull the ideas out of that. So you're not just making it up as you look at their conversations and interpret meaning. You're cross-checking. So it's very objective in the end, even though in that moment it's very subjective.
Well, I looked recently at an article that was focused on parental involvement, and they chose a discourse analysis method called discursive psychology. And it's exactly what you said. They're looking at a conversation. You talk about a micro lens. They're not looking at the big picture. They're looking at a conversation that happened between, administrator, parent, teacher, and so on. That was like an attempt to start bringing in more parents of color, minority communities into school involvement and school engagement. And it wasn't like collecting statistics on how many people, of color were participating in this program. It was looking at what the people were doing with their language.
Right.
So they're like positioning themselves in a certain way. And so discursive psychology as discourse analysis starts with an insane premise. The insane premise is that we humans don't think, and that there's no cognitive explanation for anything. So they go like totally away from the brain, and they look only at what I would say is real, which is talk, how we're talking, and how participants are talking, and what are they doing, and how are they responding. So they're focused completely on what is observable.
Right.
And what they get, starting with that, what I consider an insane premise, what they get out of it is some very useful knowledge, which proves the things.
And it's the opposite of what I was describing when going through and looking for meaning that's sort of embedded. And in this case, they're only taking what face value.
Yeah.
And both things, when you become objective, when you're looking across conversations, across cases, across people, but you learn different things because you looked at it differently, which is exactly the whole purpose of the theoretical framework. Is it gives you a way of thinking, and that's one really good example of how you could look at one conversation and do it two different ways in analyzing. So that theoretical framework is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's fun. For me, I got to review that article. And again, from what I consider a bad idea, which is assuming something totally counterintuitive, that thinking doesn't matter. Good ideas come.
Right.
Okay, well, let's look at so if people are doing this, if people, instead of actually working towards engaging in the school, they're positioning themselves and trying to show how smart they are and this and that, then we need to find a way to work around that, work through that. So some of the one of the other kind of things that's become mainstream that used to be considered artsy is like using photos. That's called photo voice, and it's often used with children. And you basically you can either get the children to take pictures, or you can present pictures. But anyone who's ever tried to interview children, even teenagers, would include in that. Sometimes they don't want to talk. It can be very challenging and difficult. And so what people realize, like, oh, photos can really get people talking, particularly, if you give them like, hey, go take pictures of your world, and then come back and talk to me about it. This is something that people also do with adults, so don't feel limited. And that's just kind of another way of generating knowledge. Again, when you think about your question and your purposes, and also one of the things that we talk about kind of at the end of the process is how you're going to share your knowledge.
Right.
These are things to think about.
I was just thinking about, as we're getting ready to wrap that and just talk about qualitative at CNU, I was going to pull up the qualitative worksheet, which is in here somewhere.
Okay.
And I'll share that on the screen for people to see while we just talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's good.
And by the way, this would be a great time if you want to make a change to it before we could do it right here on screen.
Right, while we're talking.
Yes, well, that would be authentic.
Oh yeah.
That shows that we're actually trying and learning. And
there it is.
And hit share screen. And we want the qualitative analysis worksheet. Okay, do I have two of them open? One's quantitative, one's qualitative, right? Okay, here's the worksheet. Purpose. And I always start with the purpose because dissertations start there, but there's no point in talking about it if you're not really solving a problem, right?
Yeah.
Apparently I have some sort of typo there.
Purpose. Okay.
What is the purpose of your study? Okay, so that is a personal thing, really. Because it's really what's in your context. There's a problem to solve, and then you can describe it in more general terms. But everybody has their reason for doing their study, and you can just put that in there for thinking process. Your research question. How do you know a research question is qualitative instead of quantitative?
Yeah, good question.
Well, quantitative has really specific language, like relationship between blah and blah, or difference. Is there a significant difference between this and that? Or how much does these variables contribute to this outcome? So that's sort of quantitative. Qualitative.
There's a few I'd add there. So sometimes, like if somebody says, "What are the effects?" There's certain language that has come to be associated with quantitative work that, because of the history of qualitative researchers don't like that kind of language. So even the word influence is a little bit suspect.
So effect is usually in quantitative, but affect could be in either one.
Yeah, definitely.
How does this affect that? Well, you can go into somebody's lived experiences and gather data and analyze their conversation, or give various, survey them, or there's all kinds of qualitative ways to see how people perceive, or put together your own picture, taking into account that and observations and whatnot, and coming to the researcher's conclusion, which doesn't always match the participants,
right?
Because the participants don't see all of that. So anyway, So yeah, affect, but it's very much more open-ended. And if it's not clearly a quantitative question, it might be qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also when it's nebulous, you can't test anything.
Right.
You may not even know what the variables are yet. And that's one of the great things that qualitative can do is you analyze data in around the topic, around asking deep questions, but then out of that comes things that are critical factors in that experience or that pedagogy or whatever you're studying. And those things become things that can be run quantitatively.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't know what the variables are and the literature doesn't give you anything, then you've got to do a qualitative study. It's one of the great roles.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess one way to talk about is like the whole purpose of grounded theory is to try to develop theory where none exists.
Right. And
through what some people would call inductive analysis.
Yes. Grounded theory. And that's where you go in with a hypothesis, what you think is going to happen, and you keep changing it based on data as you get it. You keep analyzing as you go, and your hypothesis at the end is, it's no longer really just a hypothesis. So this really happened in this scenario, and here's how we know from these three forms of data. It's really quite a journey, because you always come in with a bias. In grounded theory, you state that up front and talk throughout about what pieces of data changed your mind as you went. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so next blank, we've already talked a lot about theoretical framework.
One thing that a question I have. So one thing that would theoretical framework often is a little more philosophical. It's a little more, like I said, related to those two terms that are hard to pin down: epistemology and ontology. Conceptual framework really comes out of literature. So the conceptual framework within a certain topic, for example, people will have studied this and have written on it, and there will be books about your conceptual framework, but the details of the conceptual framework really are more likely to come out in empirical work that's relatively recent. That'll be kind of like the icing on the cake of the conceptual framework.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, and those things that come out at the very end that are not in a book yet are the most interesting and current and relevant things that need to be studied, and usually at the end of your lit review and lead right into your dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so, and then there's this third question of what is the qualitative research type? It's a phenomenology, grounded theory. And by the way, grounded theory could be used in several of these. There are overlaps. Right? You can do a case study using grounded theory, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, case study is one where the case defines the parameters, not necessarily the inquiry methods.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Now,
yeah. I guess if I was going to change anything, I'd just add a few things on that list. But
well, you want to do that now, or you want to do that later?
let's do it later.
Okay. We'll add to the list, but the book covers a lot of that too. But if it's things that you want them to think about as a choice, then we'll go ahead and add it to the research here in a little while. All right, key terms, that's always there in a study, and it's important to know how you're viewing that idea.
Right. One of the keys to scholarly work is to avoid making stuff up as you go along.
Right.
Right. And it comes from, like, all our knowledge comes from somewhere. And in scholarly writing, we do our best to acknowledge where it came from. And so when you're defining your key terms, you can almost always, it's going to get repetitive and boring, but you can almost always say, according to this particular person, this term means this. That is how I will use it in my study.
Right. And there's multiple choices out there, and they may all be useful, but one may lend itself more to the meaning that you're aiming at. Like integrated curriculum is one that I was talking with a student today.
Oh yeah.
And it was clear to me that our views of, and he or she, I don't remember, this person was looking at it in a really specific context of the state of Tennessee and these recommendations. And, integrated math standards happened back in like 2005 or something, or 2001. I don't remember. It's been a long time. They had separate courses, integrated math 1, 2, and 3, or you could go algebra, geometry, algebra 2.
Right.
And it was a complete alternative path that only a few schools took. But that had a very different definition than the way they're using it today. So it becomes really important for the reader to know which one. So that's why that's there, and to prove that you're not making this stuff up on your own.
Right.
Okay, so forms of data. We need 3. A lot of the common ones would be interviews, observations, surveys, artifacts.
Artifacts is such a broad term that I don't know. We need to even say anything else. Artifacts could include anything from like student work to the photo voice project, the pictures they took.
Right. If you can identify it as an object.
Yeah.
A transcript is an artifact. The words are the interview, but but when it comes down to it, the artifacts, in what I usually tell people is, artifacts are the things that come out in the interviews and surveys that you need to go look at. It's usually a document. It can be minutes from meetings, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so interviews, observations, some sources lead to the other sources. And sometimes in a logical progression, sometimes in a way you didn't expect. But artifacts are usually after the fact, but don't have to be.
An artifact these days could be a post from social media as well.
Right?
Yeah.
Just anything that you can say, here's this object to look at. So, all right. So we are going to make sure you have at least 3. Proposed analysis.
Oh, we haven't talked
methods.
about this.
Holy cow. This is where you've got a pile of data, or you may be, sometimes you're processing, actually a lot, you may be processing as you're collecting data. And you can't just randomly do that. You can't just have a hunch from what you've seen so far.
Yeah.
You've got to write notes about that data. And those notes become a code. When you start seeing patterns, it should be coded the same way. And
I think it's essential, and I think there's no excuse these days with the preponderance of, most people's phones have voice recorders now. And so you can do voice memos as you are, even in this early stage of while you're collecting data, before you've even collected data, start like making a habit of recording voice memos that, most of the smartphones now transcribe them for you. So you can just copy and paste it into a research journal later.
Because I had to go out and buy a little mini tape recorder.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the day. So the voice memo is nice, but the way I used it, that was the same way you would use your smartphone to record something. I was going out to 3 high schools and interviewing teachers. And as soon as I got back into the car, I would start talking about what I think I saw, what I need to look for in the data to make sure it was really there. But this is the trend that I saw. And So it would be a note to myself to not forget to look at those things that were fresh in my mind.
I think that it's possible. I'm thinking about our audience as we're talking here. I'm thinking it's possible they're seeing a disconnect between proposed analysis methods and what we're talking about. So I want to be very explicit. The journaling that you do after data collection is the beginning of your analysis. That's the first step of your analysis procedure. And so when you're writing up your procedures, you would make sure to tell your reader the first step in data analysis included journaling through voice memos or however you end up doing it. Because that's the thing with analysis that you want to do in qualitative research is make your thinking visible.
So in this case, I was doing interviews, and the first thing I would do is we'll call it an audio journal of first impressions, followed by open coding when I got back to a computer, and then the other, some other levels in multiple rounds. But so we don't have time to go through all of that, but this is where you really say, this is what I'm going to do. These are the steps that I expect to go through, and I expect to have multiple rounds of coding as things emerge. And
one thing I would say about analysis in general with qualitative research, and this is something that I read as I was studying the qualitative data analysis software, is that almost every single qualitative approach collects a bunch of data, disaggregates it, that is, split it into some pieces that make sense, that is, put it in some categories, and then you put it back together in a different way. So you're looking at whatever the phenomena is of your study. You have so much data that some of which will be recorded,
right?
And you're going to split this up and break it into pieces and put it back together in another way so that you will be the person that's providing a new view on this topic that has been studied for years. So you're not going to pick up some topic that's never been studied. If it hasn't been studied, I always say it's not significant.
Right. And on this third blank, how will this process be informed by the frameworks? Well, I can tell you, in the case of my interviews, the conceptual framework informed some of the questions, but it also was what I was looking for in what they said. So that's going to be very clear, it was very clear in my processes. But in addition to that, my theoretical framework did some magic, because it made, instead of just taking individuals' words and thinking of it that way, I was going in looking at them as a collective, one community as a math department in high school, and sub-communities. I called them collegial pockets. I never took
Nobody picked that one up.
Nobody picked that one up. But the idea is picked up, and it's the naturally selected study groups, basically. And so they self-select to go work on something together, or based on whether they were teaching the same class. But they were so big, at these schools, they actually would separate and say some of the Algebra 1 teachers who had the same view on things would go select. So the theoretical framework had me looking at the way they grouped themselves and the kinds of interactions in there, not just the 6 things that were in my big conceptual framework. And so it was a way of looking at how those things played out in these different collegial pockets that made it really interesting and brought out some of the big things that you need to be aware of in professional development. Like, not everybody's going to trust the other person. And they trust on different levels depending on beliefs and whether I believe your beliefs are similar to mine. So that's really important. If you don't take that into consideration, then you're going to miss out on some important connections, and some people show up to meetings and don't feel like it's their group, so they kind of turn off.
Yeah.
And I would have come up with that without the theoretical framework that I came in with.
So frameworks, I would say in general, like you got to think like we're calling them frameworks, and then you, as the researcher, need to think of them as something to frame your work.
Ooh.
It would be you'd be like in a undefined puddle of chaos without your conceptual framework. I would say in general points you towards particularly interesting things that you notice within your data, and your theoretical framework, as you say, gives you a particular way of looking at those things.
And the being in the puddle, it can feel like a lake when you've got all this data. And you may have 6 things to look at, but it helps you see things within those 6 things from the conceptual framework. It helps you look at, and it adds meaning that you wouldn't get otherwise. So it's really important, and it'll help you feel not quite as overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal with qualitative. You tend to feel overwhelmed.
Well, I was just thinking about the way we, learn in general. The way we learn in general is we have a set of experiences, right? This is a very constructivist point of view. We have a set of experiences. We have a new experience. We try to line it up with the previous experience, or we're like, no, this is totally new. Your conceptual and theoretical frameworks do that for you as well. You say, all right, this is the conceptual framework. Does what I'm seeing fit within this conceptual framework? Yes or no? Well, if not, cool, you're going to have more to write about. You're going to have suggested changes to the current conceptual theoretical literature. But if not, it's cool too, because you're like, oh, you know what? People are right. This is a good conceptual framework.
Oh, yeah, I added a couple of elements to my conceptual framework. The biggest one in my mind is contextual catalysts. In other words, what gives the teacher a reason to learn? And we all know that that's a big thing in education. Things are coming down the pike and you don't have control over them. And you have to respond and be ready. And those contextual catalysts can either lead to collegial interaction, or it can cut the throat on. Just stop it cold. And so that's an important aspect to look at. And that's one of those things that came out. And so my conceptual study or conceptual framework was expanded at the end, but all based on data. There was so much data on that it was overwhelming and needed to be added. So that was one of my outcomes. One of the findings is that framework is actually bigger. Okay, trustworthy techniques. Now I've listed some possibilities here, but the truth of the matter is I'm going to make you do peer debriefing and Mumbir checks. You might as well write that in. Persistent observation is the longer your study is in qualitative, especially with observations, the more real, more objective it ought to be, making sure that what you saw at the beginning continues to play out, or if it evolves, that's even more informative.
Yeah, with the phenomenology that I practice, one of the trustworthy techniques is a type of peer debriefing, in that you would take an interview transcript, analyze it yourself, and then you bring it to the research group and analyze it as a group. And so in a sense, you get like almost like an auditor, a set of auditors who are like very experienced in phenomenology to take a look at the transcript, and you say, hey, what kind of overlap? Did they find the same things that I found? Did they point out something new that I need to keep my eye out in my next interview? That kind of thing. And that's something that has been, mean, that's why I stuck with phenomenology, is because the group is fun. We sit around and analyze these transcripts and you get a lot of work done, but it's good work and people are collegial.
That's always nice. I was a solo cowboy that nobody understood.
There you go. So,
they were all doing very different studies, more quantitative mindset.
But some people, and that's a cool thing about this group, because it's because of kind of the attitude of phenomenology. They're open and interested in like everything, and so you get a bunch of people who are like, "Whoa, I want to know what this person said in response to your question.
Right.
I want to go through this interview. It's really like, people are fascinating." And I left the world of science because I kind of felt like it wasn't. I had probably a misconception that it was more like going to be solo, isolated work. And I was like, I guess I'm not cut out for that. I do much better work in groups.
Right.
I do much better thinking with other people to bounce thoughts off of. And so this phenomenology group not only has a great trustworthiness technique, but it suited my personality as a researcher.
Right.
That's something that you'll find as you go through this is, as you go through the dissertation process, qualitative or quantitative, you'll kind of discover things about yourself as a researcher, particularly if you haven't done any formal research before.
Yeah.
You're going to find, tendencies, and some of them are going to be good and lead towards better trustworthiness.
Right.
But some of them might not.
Right. Okay. So let's bring that back into trustworthy techniques, because when you using two heads are better than one, getting input, a peer debriefer is often somebody in your context, but not in your study. And I always say their job is to ask the same question over and over, because you tell them what you think you're finding and they say, show me. Like they're from Missouri, like show me some data that tells you that, and they'll sort of double check your thinking whether that really is going that way, or you're sort of superimposing it just because you kind of, it's part of your bias. They're checking for your bias and making sure that whatever conclusions you start to come to are truly based in the data that you have. So that's a big thing. Member checks, simply we're going back to the members of the participants in the study saying, here's what I found, and tell me more about that. Do I understand what's going on? And getting some feedback to clarify and sometimes correct, or make you go back and really double check. Sometimes they're wrong.
Yeah,
but you just go back and check the data to see whether what they're saying may be valid.
It's an ethical step. It's a step in ethics, not just trustworthiness. Because if you go back and you say, hey, here's what I got from your interview, you may be exactly right. More than likely you are. But if the person says, no, that's not what I said, what may be happening here is they have suddenly had some reservations about what they said, and what I feel like I could say you're obligated to say, okay, well, if you don't want me to include this in my study, I won't. So that's a thing that member check allows you to have an ethical position as the researcher, to be able to say, okay, I'm gonna take care of my participants. They're helping me learn what I want to learn. So this person, it's rare. It's very rare,
because we're a Christian university and we take care of people. So do it. Okay. So everybody knows sufficiently thick description just means pretty much that.
Don't give me a thick description unless you are capable of writing thick descriptions. And if you want to practice or look at descriptions, then you need to go read somebody like John Muir, or somebody literary who made a living writing descriptions of things. Some particular author that you might like, who's maybe an author of fiction. You're like, well, this description put me in that story. I was totally lost in the book. Go back and use that as an example, because I don't want
You don't want
Anyway,
rambling
I want
on
good.
details. You want
I
details
want
that
big
matter
description.
and set the
Exactly,
tone for
exactly.
understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Audit trail is simply collecting everything. And I personally kept every piece of evidence in a printed up and in a box. And I kept it for 7 years after I graduated. And after 7 years, I checked the date.
What does IRB require here for that? Because they're required to keep data a certain amount of time.
I don't recall.
Yeah, okay.
We'll have to ask
Well, we'll
Dr.
figure that
Price.
out
He's
for
on the
you.
committee.
That's right.
But you keep it so that somebody, it's a form of accountability saying, I am willing to let somebody come in and look through raw data. They can't keep it, you can't, because there's privacy issues, anonymous issues, but you keep it in a form that somebody can come and look at and say, yeah, okay, I see why you came to that conclusion. If they were really doubting what happened. And so just by stating that you're going to do this, that you've got it in a box or electronically in a box, whatever, you're keeping the evidence so that could be looked at. That adds trustworthiness.
Yeah, all the things that your member check person says, show me, all that stuff should be part of the audit trail, the journaling and so on that you do, the observation reports, every artifact, all these things, these are part of your audit trail. And actually, the better you organize your audit trail, the easier time you're going to have writing your dissertation.
That's true. That's true. So basically, anything that was created, any document that was created as part of your dissertation process should be part of your audit trail. That's why I had a really big box.
You'll have a lot of files.
We already mentioned triangulation, and you will do that. You will do peer debriefing, although I count focus groups after the fact. That's a form of peer debriefing.
Yeah.
You were definitely gonna do triangulation, or reflexivity is one option, but there's lists, and it was, these things are in the book.
I'll say that I'm not going to accept a qualitative dissertation that doesn't have some reflexivity or positionality statement. So,
in other words, you say what you're thinking,
who you are, how you approach the topic, your history with the topic, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Because it shows
people put
your
that in
bias.
chapter 1, but some people put it in chapter 3, and I'm fine either way, really.
Yeah. Okay. What's the next thing? Oh, I began to make a list, but I basically said, okay, you're going to do these, so make sure I put a little asterisk. You can do all of those and hopefully more, but I don't want to see stuff without those. Participant selection. You're picking these participants for a very specific reason. If you can't tell me why, then don't pick them. You are setting this up to really go in deep on something. So, in this case, in my case, I selected all the teachers at 3 schools because they were each doing some different form of math reform. So that was very purposeful, and I picked them all about the same so I could compare schools going through processes with similar goals but different means. So just tell me exactly why, and so here's your N. How many teachers are involved, or how many students are?
Some of the language I've seen used in qualitative research, we use the term participants in general. Some people even use the term co-researcher, which I don't agree with, but it doesn't matter. Don't call them subjects, though. That's the
not subjects. These are participants. Use the word in the worksheet.
That's right. Just use the word in the worksheet.
Okay, limitations, delimitations. this is really more quantitative than qualitative, but some people like to see that. And you as the researcher are a lens, and that's always one of the limitations of qualitative. So you have to acknowledge that. What else would you put in?
Well, when this kind of for me depends on what they choose as their methodology. But in general, to increase the rigor and transparency of a qualitative study, you talk about limitations, that is, things that are out of your control that relate to your study and the knowledge that you're generating. And then delimitations are choices that you make so that you don't go insane with too many, like you can have so much data. And so you have to say, I had, let's say, just for example, let's say I had 50 participants. And if you had 50 participants and you interviewed every single one of them, and you audio recorded those interviews and you transcribed them, you would never finish. You would have too much data.
Guess what?
What?
51. And I never should have done 51. I will tell people no. I will say no, because that's stupid. And yes.
Yeah, but
that was crazy, and you're never going to finish.
There you go. 51.
I say things like 6.
Yeah, no.
6 is a good number.
Here's the thing. If you're going to do more than that, then you choose to delimit the way you're collecting data. So you may interview all these people and you say, I'm going to interview 20 people, which would still be a lot, and just take notes during the interview on what they say. So
right.
Those notes would then become a delimitation, because you have the possibility to get a transcription of every word they said if you just.
But in most of your cases, if you're doing qualitative, we're going to keep you under 10 and probably closer to 5 or 6, because then you can go really, really, really deep.
That's the thing that people sometimes don't understand, is that people are busy and it's hard to get people to talk to you. And then you do an interview and you're like, oh, that one didn't go well.
Well, I always give the number 6, because you can do a great study with 1, but people generally like to see more.
Yeah.
You can do a great study with 3 and have people applaud, but if you start out with 3 and a student moves out of the district, you no longer have sort of a critical number. So I always say, 6 is a good starting point. And if you lose, but it depends on the context and the question. Sometimes I'll suggest smaller, sometimes I'll suggest a little bigger.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the things that I'm thinking about. That and like you said, that's a limitation. Is I'm only doing these. I'm doing it for a very good reason. You did your purposeful sampling, but it's also a limitation in terms of you're really not getting at things that are outside of those 6.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you're confused at all about Dr. Taylor said, limitations and delimitations is more focused on quantitative research.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. You can do limitations and delimitations with a goal. The particular goal is always trustworthiness, rigor, making sure that the knowledge that you produce is contextualized for the reader so that they understand the claims that you're making.
Right. So in a quantitative study, limitations and delimitations are things that hurt your study. In qualitative research, you still have those same limitations or delimitations, but it's not considered a setback.
Mm-hmm. It's just a fact. It's just like, this was part of the study.
And that's what made the study possible, to go so deep and learn things that you couldn't learn.
Right.
Quantitatively.
Yeah. In a quantitative study, they'd say, we only had 10 people, so it's not a good study. In qualitative research, you would say, I had 10 people.
10, that's pretty big.
Which, that would be a limitation in qual, because you have too much data.
That's too many. All right. What's left? Okay.
Actual analysis is a complex process.
Yes. And I think I have a thing about Excel, just reminding you, because some people use Excel to help them sort data.
Yeah.
But there's other qualitative programs, and when you have a lot of data, they can be extremely helpful.
I used I used MaxQDA, MaxQDA, because it's the only one that I could buy, and the license never expired. Everything else is like a yearly subscription type thing when I looked, and that was in 2015. Okay, so that's the only reason I recommend MaxQDA. All of them have relatively similar features. There's one called NVivo, there's one called Atlas, there's one called QDA Minor. There's a whole lot of them. And what they do is they give you a single place to put all your artifacts. And so that's nice. They allow you to do coding with like drag and drop. Some people like to do coding within Microsoft Word, and they just do highlighting and underlining and comments out to the side.
There's actually a few Excel spreadsheets out there that are set up to handle certain types of qualitative data.
Yeah.
And you'll do some of the same color coding, but there's a little more to it. So that's something you should search for and find a couple of examples. Everybody does it differently. I do not teach one method or one software because everybody is a little bit different. Your data sources are a little bit different, and I couldn't possibly teach all of them.
Yeah.
The same way I couldn't teach every test that exists in the quantitative side. I can't show you all of the things. So this is where your colleagues in the program who have just come out of it, if they have a study similar to yours and they have a recommendation, that might be a good idea. Your chair may have a preference, and I don't have a preference. I care about the big ideas of what your coding processes are, and I do require some snapshots. I just began to do that because
that's nice.
That's really important in sharing and building trustworthiness. What did the coding look like? Exactly. Give me a few examples.
Yeah.
But that's in the write-up. We'll cover that, and I will post stuff online about that on my website that we used earlier in this year's class. But for future classes, I'm going to post that on my personal website and give you a link.
The main authority that people are citing these days on coding is Johnny Saldana, Saldana, with the squiggly A. And he's on his second edition.
And with the squiggly?
Yeah,
really?
Yeah.
Enye.
Spanish. I used to teach Spanish, so I know to tell people. And with the squiggly. Yeah, and he, this is something that, I've got various scans from it that I can share with you if you're interested. I've got, I think it's first chapter of that second edition scan. That may be something I can pass along to you. Because he's kind of, when everybody talks about coding, he has written an entire book on it. And everybody cites him, so he's a good source.
And the other thing is, if you're watching this, you should be aware that Dr. Davidson is also going to make a few videos about coding and other qualitative processes that he wants to share. And I will post those within the class as soon as I get them, and then on my personal website, so that it's always available all the time, regardless of what class or what stage you're in. So you could even look at it after you graduated if you wanted to keep going and do your own work. So those things will be available as well as this. Well, Dr. Sohn, we got to see the handshake. Okay.
Wait, it looks like an arm. There we go.
All right. So we take this very seriously around here. All right, thanks. We'll see you online.